one very, very interesting topic today. So Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. We begin by praising Allah and asking Allah to send His peace and blessings upon the final Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and all those who follow his way with righteousness until the end of time. Today, inshallah, we are going to discuss the first two primary sources of fiqh, of Islamic law, which is the Quran and the Sunnah. And I purposely mentioned Sunnah, not Hadith. You'll understand why when we look at the different Madh'habs and the definitions of Sunnah. Right? So today we're going to discuss the primary sources of Islamic law. But before we get into that, very briefly a recap of what we covered in the first 2 weeks. Right? For those who weren't here. In the first week, we discussed basic terminology and we looked at what are the sources of Islamic law. So just to recap, fiqh means a person's understanding of Islamic law. Different from Sharia. Sharia is what Allah revealed. Right? Sharia is what Allah revealed. Fiqh is how people understand it. Right? So the Sharia is Salah. Salah is part of the Sharia. Where you place your hands, do you say the Ameen loudly or quietly? This is fiqh. These are different people's understandings of the Sharia. Right? So we said Sharia is the law, fiqh is the understanding of the law. Usulul fiqh is how we work out that understanding. What's our methodology? And we said that there are 4 agreed upon sources of Islamic law. 4 things that the main madhhabs agree upon. Number 1 is the Quran, which we are going to discuss very briefly today. Number 2 is the Sunnah, which we're going to spend the bulk of today discussing. Right? Number 3 is the consensus of the scholars, the ijma, that we'll discuss next week. And number 4 is qiyas, logical deduction based on primary principles extracted from the Quran and Sunnah, that we will discuss next week as well. So essentially, we're breaking this topic, the 4 sources of fiqh, into 2 lessons. This week, Quran and Sunnah. Next week, ijma and qiyas. Now, I have to make a couple of notes before we get started on today's. The first note is that what we are teaching is based on the traditional understanding of Islam, right? Meaning, I take it for granted that everybody here accepts the Quran and Sunnah as sources of Islamic law. And there's nobody here who's going to fight about the Sunnah being a source of Islamic law, at least if not, okay, it's fine, but we can discuss it in the Q&A segment, right? We open for everybody, but understand the perspective I'm coming from is that Sunnah is a source of Islamic law, right? Which is the position of all the madhhabs, right? So we're going to discuss it from that perspective. We will talk about the other perspectives and why I don't agree with them, but this is the perspective we are coming from. That the Quran and the Sunnah are agreed upon by all the madhhabs as the primary sources of Islamic law. The second point about today is we're going to focus primarily on the Sunnah. Why? Because that's where most of fiqh is from. There's very little laws we get from the Quran, right? Most of it comes from the Sunnah. So that's where we're going to focus on. Another reason we're going to focus on the Sunnah is that it's the most misunderstood of the sources of Islamic law. What do I mean by this? I mean by this, number 1, there are some people who take it too literally. Right? They take hadith too literally and they end up misinterpreting the religion. Number 2, there are people who reject hadith altogether, taking the misinterpretation in a different direction. Right? Number 3, most people are completely unaware of the fact that not every hadith is a sunnah. Meaning not every hadith is to be practiced on. There are hadiths which are abrogated, there are hadiths which fall into other categories. We will discuss all of that today. Right? So we are going to discuss a lot on the hadith, mainly because it's very misunderstood. And so this is going to be our main focus. So what we're going to do is 1 slide on Quran, 10 slides on hadith. I know it seems disproportionate, but really when you study the books of fiqh, you mainly study hadith. So you need to understand why and how the hadith is studied. Okay, one last thing to revise before we get into this week's topic. And that is last week. What did we cover last week? Who knows? What was last week's topic? Yes, the history. History of fiqh. What are madhhabs? Where did madhhabs come from? Why do we have them? Very simply put, this is a natural development. Right? Naturally, when a field comes about, people take different positions within that field. Right? In fact, you have madhhabs in everything. You have madhhabs in psychology. You have madhhabs in government. Right? Communism and capitalism are like different madhhabs. Right? In psychology, behaviorists and the other ones, they're all different madhhabs. right? So in any field where people are using their mind and they're coming up with principles, you're going to get different ways of looking at it. It's the same with fiqh. Different scholars came up with different approaches to fiqh, right? We said there are 4 madhhabs which are famous. The Hanafi, which is dominant, about 45% of the world is Hanafi, right? Then there's the Shafi'i, that's the second largest. Then the Maliki, that's a bit smaller. And then there are smaller madhabs, like the Hanbali, the Zaidi, the Zahiri. All of these madhabs exist, but they are much smaller in number. So we can say there are 3 large madhabs and there are many other smaller madhabs. What is a madhab? We say a madhab simply means a scholar's approach to fiqh and everybody who follows his approach to fiqh. Note, I'm not saying that a mazhab means every opinion that person had. That's not what the mazhab is. It's his approach to fiqh. How did he go about it? Right? So, keep all of that in mind when we talk about this week's topic, inshallah. So let's get started with this week's topic. Number 1, the Quran. Everybody who is a Muslim, even those who may have misguided understandings of Islam, all accept the Quran as the source of Islamic law. Am I right? Right? Everybody. There's no dispute. And this is one reason why we're only spending one slide on the Quran, is that it's agreed upon. You literally can't be a Muslim if you don't accept the Quran as your source of law. It's like unimaginable that somebody say, I'm a Muslim but I don't believe in the Quran as a source of law. It's like, it just doesn't happen. So that's why we're not going to go too much into it. The Quran is the primary source of Islamic law. However, we don't get that much law from it because that's not the purpose of the Quran. Right? The Quran in general is there to provide guidance. The guidance comes in the form of spirituality, in terms of our beliefs, stories of the prophets that we derive lessons from, and the laws as well. So the laws make up less than a third of the Quran. In fact, even much less than that. Right? The bulk of the Quran is stories of the prophets. After that, they are the verses about our beliefs. After that, they are the verses about our manners, our character, our spirituality, tazkiyah, all of that. After that, they are the laws of the Quran. So the laws of the Quran are actually a very small part of the Quran. Why? Let's see if anyone has answers to that. Why? Why doesn't the Quran just give us all the laws? So there's no differences of opinion.
Change circumstances.
Circumstances change. Good, Professor, right? The circumstances change, right? It's not just that, but that's actually one of the main reasons. But there are other reasons as well. So, as I said earlier, what did I say was the purpose of the Quran? Why did Allah reveal the Quran? Guidance, right? In guidance, law is secondary. What's the primary area we need guidance? Our beliefs. Our beliefs. The bulk of the Quran is our beliefs. About Allah, about the Prophet ﷺ, about the Day of Judgment, about Jannah, about Jahannam, about how the world will end, about the prophets who came in the past, about the people of the past, about the punishment in the grave. All of these things make up the bulk of the Quran. Why? When it comes to guidance, what is more important? Our beliefs or our laws? Our beliefs are more important. If someone doesn't believe in La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, they're not going to care whether they're supposed to wear hijab or not. Right? Beliefs come first. So that's why the Quran focuses primarily on belief. Number 2, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, He sent the Prophet ﷺ to explain and to teach the Quran. And so the details about how to do what the Quran says, the details are found where? In the Hadiths, in the Sunnah. Right? So therefore you will not find that much of the Quran focused on law. A very interesting subject I like to study. I have a lot of books in this field. It's called Ahkamul Quran, the laws of the Quran. These are books of tafsir that focus only on fiqh. And now when you see the other books of tafsir, like if you have a book of tafsir like covering everything, it's normally like this big, right? Like 30 volumes or something like that. The Ahkamul Quran books are normally like 2 volumes or 3 volumes. Why? Because only that amount of verses in the Quran actually discuss fiqh. There's only like very few verses that are actually relevant to law. The bulk of it is our aqidah, our beliefs, and our spirituality. Right? Very important. There are 2 types of laws we find in the Quran. The first is explicit. Right? The Arabic word for this is qat'i. Qat'i. It is something that is concrete. It is explicit, it is clear. It's something where there's no difference of opinion upon it. Right? The Quran says that we should establish salah. Everybody agrees upon what the word salah means in that verse. There's no two opinions about what salah means in that verse. Right? The Quran says that Allah is one. Are there differences of opinion about what that means? No, it's qat'i. Right? So the explicit verses of the Quran make up our Sharia, which is unchangeable and agreed upon. Right? Our Sharia is taken from the qat'i verses. Right? But there are verses that are also, they give implications or that we derive law from. It's not clear. Right? The Arabic word used here is zanni. Zanni means it's speculative. Meaning it could mean what we're saying, it could mean something else. This is where differences of opinion and fiqh come from. Basic example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that if a man touches a woman and he cannot find water, he should make tayammum. Touches a woman, what does it mean? Imam Shafi says, if you touch a woman, your wudu breaks. Right? So he takes the verse literally. Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Malik, they say, if you touch a woman with lust, your wudu breaks. Right? Imam Abu Hanifa, he says it's referring to intimate relations and he's talking about ghusl, not wudu. So it's one verse, three different understandings. All three understandings are zanni. It's all speculation. Meaning, each of those imams, if you had to ask them, they will say, this is my opinion, I could be wrong. Meaning somebody else's interpretation of this verse could be right. Right? So this is where we get implied or derived law in the Quran. Where a scholar looks at a verse and he says, oh, I think this verse means this. Allah says in the Quran that the animals of the ocean are halal for me. Right? So lots of us a lot of Muslims are like hardcore Hanafi until he comes to that verse. Right? And then you're like, I'm going with the Quran. Right? And again, no problem with that from my perspective, but some people will have a problem with that. But the point is that verse is zanni. It's speculative. Right? There's different interpretations of it. Imam Abu Hanifa says animals of the ocean means fish. Imam Ashafi says no, it means all the animals of the ocean. And so now we have different certification bodies deciding, do we give it the halal stamp or not? It's called calamari. Does it get the stamp or not? Right? Because this is a matter of speculation. So understand, each madh'hab has its own approach to the Quran. Each madh'hab has its own approach to the Quran. In the sense that some madh'habs take it more literally, some take it more from a practical perspective, some look at the Quran through the lens of the Hadith. Other madh'habs will only allow a Hadith to come into play if it reaches a certain level. Right? So there's a variety of approaches here in terms of how do we approach the Quran for fiqh. Right? Now let's go to our main topic, the Sunnah. Why do you think I said Sunnah and not Hadith? Okay, firstly, what's the difference?
Sunnah is actual practice.
Sunnah is the practice. The Hadith is? Narration. The word Hadith means narration, right? A narration about what the Prophet ﷺ said or did or proved of is called a Hadith. That actual thing that he said or did is the Sunnah. So when the Prophet ﷺ said, do not eat with your left hand because shaitan eats with your left hand, with his left hand. That is a Hadith. What is the Sunnah that we derive from the Hadith? Eat with your right hand. Understand? So the Hadith is what he said. The Sunnah is the message we take from it, the practicality of it. Now each madh'hab has a different approach to how we approach the Hadith and what we accept from it as Sunnah. And again, Sunnah here, the word Sunnah has different meanings. I don't want you to get confused. Sunnah in fiqh means recommended. That's not the meaning we're taking here. This is Sunnah in Usulul Fiqh. What does Sunnah in Usulul Fiqh mean? Anyone knows? What does Sunnah mean when we say that Sunnah is the source of law? What does it mean? It means everything that the Prophet ﷺ said or did. Everything. Right? The Sunnah as a source of law can be a source from which we say something is compulsory. Meaning, you can take a hadith and derive from that hadith that something is compulsory, from the Sunnah. So Sunnah here has a different meaning. Again, this is something that people get confused with. Just like in English, words have different meanings in different contexts. Right? Like the word fast. You fast in Ramadan or you run fast. Most people can't do both at the same time. Right? But it's the same word, different meanings. But the Sunnah is the same. Sunnah, when you're talking about bid'ah versus sunnah, we're talking about orthodox Islam versus, innovative practices. Sunnah, when you're talking about categories of fiqh, it means something that's recommended, right? Sunnah, when you're talking about usulul fiqh, it means anything you derive from the hadith, right? So the Hanafis are the strictest when it comes to taking hadith and elevating it to a source of Islamic law. And simply put, the Hanafi madhab will only accept hadiths of the highest category of authenticity, and only then will they accept it for making something compulsory or haram. They will accept it lower levels for making something recommended or makruh or halal, but not for halal and haram. There it's only Quran and the highest level of hadith. So we need to just stop there to discuss the different levels of hadith. The scholars of hadith, now this is a different field, hadith, right? The scholars of hadith, they grade hadiths based on the strength of the chain of narrators. To simplify it, we can say there's 4 gradings, right? There's actually more, but to simplify it. Number 1 is Sahih hadith. Sahih hadith means, what does Sahih mean? Authentic or true, right? Sahih also means true. Yes, it's sound, it's authentic, it's true. Sahih simply means that when they analyze the chain of narrators, they found that every single person there is a pious person who doesn't lie, with a good memory, he met the person he's actually narrating from. That's called a Sahih hadith, right? So something that's true. It's definitely what the Prophet ﷺ said, right? Next level is Hasan. Hasan means that there's a little bit of doubt, but we believe it's true. So it's translated as acceptable, right? We'll translate as acceptable. This hadith is acceptable. So for example, if somebody narrated a hadith from his teacher, and we know he's intelligent, we know he's pious, we know he's a good Muslim, we know he doesn't lie, but we also know he sometimes made mistakes. He had a bad memory, right? He sometimes makes mistakes. There, a scholar might not put it all the way to Sahih. He might say, Hasan. It's acceptable, but the possibility is wrong. Level 3, Da'if. Da'if means weak. Now here, a lot of people don't understand what's a weak hadith. A lot of people mix up weak and fabricated. What's a weak hadith?
Chain.
What's about the chain?
Missing chain of narrators.
Missing chain of narrators, what else? One of the narrators had a very bad memory. One of the narrators wasn't that pious. One of the narrators, we're not sure if he met his teacher or not. Right? Da'if actually means we don't know if it's authentic or not. It has the possibility of being authentic, it has the possibility of not being authentic. That's what da'if actually means. We don't know. Right? It's a matter of it could be true, it could not be true. Right? Now a lot of people don't know that. They treat da'if like it's level 4. What's level 4? Mawdu', fabricated. Here we know for sure, in the chain of narrators, there's an individual who lies. He makes up hadiths. We don't accept it. Nobody accepts mawdu' hadith. Right? So with all of these levels, and now there's levels in other ways as well, the Hanafi madhab goes only for the strongest and highest level. Especially when it comes to changing the meaning of the Quran or adding to the meaning of the Quran. And this is why you will find a lot of differences of opinion between the Hanafi madhab on one side and all the other madhabs on the other side. Right? Let me give 2 examples of that. Example number 1. Can a woman get married without her father's permission? Hanafi madhab says yes, the other 3 madhabs say no. Why? The other 3 madhabs say that the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever gets married without the permission of their wali, their nikah is void. Authentic hadith. Hanafi madhab says, hold on, this hadith is authentic, but it's not the highest level of authenticity. It's not acceptable for modifying the Quran. And what does the Quran say? Imam Abu Hanifa says that the Quran says, the verse about divorce, Allah says, after her iddah is over, she can marry whoever else she wants. Look how Abu Hanifa looks at the verse. He says, the verse doesn't say her father can marry her off to whoever she wants. It says she can marry whoever she wants. So she's in charge. Right? So Imam Abu Hanifa is saying that the Quran is saying she can get married. A hadith that's authentic but not that level of authentic is saying that she needs her father's permission to get married. So what the Hanafi madhab will say, it's recommended to have your father's permission, but if a woman gets married without her father's permission, it's still valid. Right? So this is a difference between the Hanafi madhab and the others based on what? The authenticity of the hadith is authentic but not highest level. Right? So this is why they have a difference of opinion there. Second example, you go for a swim, that they count as making wudu. Hanafi madhab says yes, the other three madhabs say no. Why? Opening hadiths of Sahih Bukhari. Actions are judged by the intentions. Authentic, everyone accepts it as authentic. This hadith is only narrated through Umar radiallahu anhu. It's only narrated through one chain of narrators. So it's authentic, but again, Imam Abu Hanifa says, not on the level to modify the meaning of the Quran. What does the Quran say? The Quran says, if you wash your face, hands, make massage of your head and wash your feet, then you can pray. It doesn't mention intention. It doesn't mention you must have intention. So Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion would be, intention is recommended, but without it your wudu is valid. The other three madhabs would say no, the hadith is authentic, we go with that. So I know this gets complicated, but I just hope through this, you understand why there's difference of opinion, right? That certain hadiths are authentic, but in the Hanafi Usul, it's not on the level for making something compulsory or haram. So they use that just for makruh and for mustahab, right? The Malikis have a different understanding of Sunnah from the other madhabs. According to the Maliki madhab, whatever the people of Medina were practicing at the time of Imam Malik is Sunnah, even if it contradicts a single hadith, right? So for example, in the Maliki madhab, the methodology of praying salah, leaving the hands by the side, right? All of this, they get it from where? That was the practice of the people of Medina at that time. So why did Imam Malik say this? Why did Imam Malik say that he goes with what the people of Medina is doing and not with the hadith? Why? They are closest to the Prophet. That this is a group of thousands of people who is practicing Muslims, thousands of practicing Muslims whose grandparents were Sahaba. So this is the Sunnah passed down generation to generation. And the hadith comes from one person and he's saying something else. Right? So they would only accept the hadith as if it contradicted the practice of the people of Medina, if it reached the highest level of authenticity. And I'm making it very simplified. There's actually a whole lot of other terminology to understand this better. I'm not going to get into that. That you'll get into if you actually pursue this in a university level. Shafi mazhab has the simplest approach. If the hadith is authentic, that is my madhab. Have you heard that statement of Imam Shafi? Right? If the hadith is authentic, that is my madhab. That's actually the Shafi approach. If the hadith is authentic, Imam Shafi follows it. Right? Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal's approach, even if the hadith is weak, I rather follow that than use my own opinion. This is Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal's approach. Right? Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal says, even if a hadith is weak, I would rather follow a weak hadith than come up with my own opinion. So now you understand why when it comes to hadith, we end up with so many different opinions. Look at this, how many different approaches there are. And one more approach, the Zahiris. What does the word Zahiri mean? I told you all this last week. What does Zahiri mean? Literalist. So what do the Zahiris do? Take the hadith literally. And nowadays we have groups who do this in our country. We have these new groups who take the hadith literally. And to be completely frank with you, the ISIS, Al-Qaeda mentality comes from this. It comes from people who take the hadith too literally. A lot of what the Prophet ﷺ said, it's said in an exaggerated fashion. It's not meant to be taken literally. Right? So for example, the Prophet ﷺ said that I would burn down the houses of the people who don't come to the masjid for salah. Had any madhab ever taken this hadith literally? There's no madhab that tells you to burn down people's houses for not coming to salah. Right? They took this as the Prophet ﷺ talking in an exaggerated way to encourage people to go to the masjid. They debated on whether it means that going to the masjid is wajib or sunnah, but nobody ever took it literally. Nobody ever took it to mean that we must go burn people's houses down. Unfortunately, some people today, that's what they will do. They will look at this hadith and say, the Prophet said this, that's what it means. Right? It's not as simple as that. And what we're going to get into today is there are so many factors to consider before you take a hadith and make a ruling on it. That's going to be the bulk of today's lesson. But before we do that, I was debating whether to do this or not, but I decided we need to discuss the contemporary approaches towards the Sunnah as well. Right? So these are the 5 classical approaches. Now let's talk about 5 contemporary approaches. Does anyone remember last week I mentioned the 4 contemporary approaches towards fiqh? Does anyone remember those?
Modernist.
The modernists, what else? Traditionalists, what else? 2 more?
Reforms.
Non-conformists, right?
Reforms.
And the reformers, good. So when it comes to the Sunnah, it's the same, but we add one more category which is new that didn't exist in the past. That's the Quranist. Right, the Quranist. Right? The Quranists only popped up in the past 200 years as a group. They were individuals throughout history, but not as a group. It comes from the Orientalists. The Orientalists, about 200 years ago, 300 years ago, they started writing books to try and prove the Hadiths are not authentic. And some Muslims read these books and believed it and started stop following Hadith. And then the Quranist movement formed around that. So this is a new approach. They reject the Sunnah, they only follow Quran. This approach is very problematic, because the bulk of fiqh comes from the Sunnah. You really cannot formulate fiqh without the Sunnah, right? Furthermore, it's going against the ijma, the consensus of the scholars throughout history. So this makes it a problematic approach. Approach number 2, traditionalists, or to be more frank, when it comes to hadith, the second approach is taqleed, right? Blind following. What does this mean? The second approach is, I'll follow my madhab, but I only mention hadith when it agrees with my madhab. Otherwise, we're not going to mention it. Right? So a lot of people nowadays have this approach. They don't study hadith, they don't teach hadith, they don't get involved with hadith. They'll only bring it up if it agrees with them. Right? I don't know if you have noticed that some people will only bring up a hadith when it agrees with them. Right? So for example, some men only bring up the hadith about the rights of the husband. They never mention the hadith about the responsibilities of the husband. Right? They only bring up a hadith when it agrees with them. Many madhhabs nowadays take this approach. They only mention the hadith when it supports them. Otherwise, they don't want people to know about the other hadiths that don't support them. Number 3, the modernist. What is the modernist approach to hadith? The modernist approach simply is, if the hadith doesn't agree with my logic, I reject it. If it agrees with my logic, I will use it. So they take what we call they take the rationalist approach to hadith, right? So they take the rationalist approach. Number 4, the Ahl Hadith. Originally I wrote Salafi approach, but the Ahl Hadith approach. So this approach popped up about less than 100 years ago with Shaykh Albani, rahimahullah, where he started the Salafi movement, and they call it Quran and Sahih Hadith. That's their approach. They call it Quran and Sahih Hadith. And it's a very literalist approach to Hadith. And finally, number 5, this is the approach I take, which is reformist. So what does reformist mean? Reformist simply means we're going to reanalyze the Hadith using the principles of our madhab, which means we may or may not come to the same conclusions as the founders of the madhab. But we will engage with the Hadith. We will study it. We will analyze it. We're not just going to just follow. Right? Which means we have the same principles as our founders, but sometimes our conclusions will be different. Right? So like I myself follow Hanafi Usul, but many of my conclusions are not Hanafi. Not fitting with the traditional Hanafi view, because we go back and reanalyze the Hadith, say, okay, this Hadith, at the time of the Prophets of Abu Hanifa, it was not at the level needed to make something compulsory or acceptable. But today it is. Today when we add what the books written afterwards, last week Muhammad mentioned about how after the time of the Madh'habs, the books Sahih Bukhari, all of that were written. Now we have those books. Now we can go back and say, hold on, this Hadith really is that level of authentic. So we need to change this opinion. Right? So I mentioned this so that just that you know, when you meet people, generally anybody you meet falls into one of these 5 categories. Right? Very rare to meet a Quranist, but I know a few. Some of them are friends of mine. I try to convince them to come back to the Sunnah, but back to the Sunnah literally, because Quranists reject Sunnah, right? But that's a new approach. Taqleed, the majority of people fall in this category. Majority of people just follow. There's literally no study of hadith at all. Modernist, this is a minority approach. It's problematic. The problem here is each person's rationale is different. So each person's understanding of what's logical or not is different. So one person may look at a hadith and say, this hadith doesn't make sense to me, I'm not going to accept it. Somebody else will look at the hadith and say, I don't see anything wrong with it. Right? I mean, how do we decide whose rationale is the right one for judging hadith? It opens up a whole can of worms. This approach started with the late Shaykh Muhammad Abdul rahimahullah from Egypt, right? He was essentially the first scholar to take a rationalist approach to hadith, and he rejected many hadiths on the basis of it not agreeing with his logic. He was a great scholar, but unfortunately he was also literally the founder of modernism. By the way, here's an interesting point. It was Muhammad Abdu and his student Rashad Rida who were the first people to refer to themselves as Salafis. Right? That's a very interesting point. The first people to call themselves Salafis were actually the modernists. And it was Albani who was studying Rashad Rida's books who found this term Salafi and took it and gave it to a completely different movement, which is movement number 4. So the term Salafi meant something completely different 100 years ago. In fact, first it was only invented 100 years ago, and it meant something completely different back then. So right till today, nobody knows what a Salafi is. Because every group got their own definition for it. Right? That's why I use the term Ahl Hadith instead, because it's more clear. Right? Because technically, if you go with South Africans' understanding of the term Salafi, it's everybody here besides the first two groups. Right? But all of these groups have completely different approaches to hadith. You can't put them all into one category and put one label on them. It's not fair. The problem I have with the Ahl Hadith approach to fiqh is that it's too literal. They tend to see a hadith which they think is authentic and just take it literally, even if there are other principles of fiqh which explain it better. And unfortunately, a lot of people who went down this path, if you study the history, it was people who went down this path. Many of them ended up founding groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all of this because they just went so literalist into the understanding of hadith that when the Prophet ﷺ said, I was sent to fight the people until they believe in La ilaha illallah, they took it literally. Right? And this approach has its problems as well. That's why I prefer the reformist approach. The Usul al-Fiqh help us to stay within the boundaries of what is acceptable. Okay, we have a lot to cover about how to use hadith in fiqh. But for now, is everybody with me? Is everybody clear up to this point? Now, I mentioned about hadith. You cannot just take a hadith and make a ruling on it. Major problem of our time. This problem has led to a lot of deviant movements and wrong understandings and extremism in our time. Right? Why? Because there are so many factors to consider. There are factors to consider. When you find a hadith, there are certain things to keep in mind before you can say, I'm following this hadith. You cannot just jump into it. Because the Prophet ﷺ, when he said something, there are certain things we have to keep in mind. Number one, obviously, is it authentic? That's the obvious one, right? Is it authentic? Number two, the level of strength of the hadith. So even amongst authentic hadiths, there are different levels, right? So there are authentic hadiths that come from only one chain of narrators. There are authentic hadiths which come from a dozen chain of narrators. Right? Or there are some authentic hadiths where the narrator of the hadith never practiced on it himself. Right? Meaning one of the Sahaba narrated that the Prophet ﷺ said something, but he himself is doing the opposite. You have to think about that. Why? Why is the scholar, the alim amongst the Sahabi narrating something but doing the opposite? It means he's not understanding it the way we did. Or maybe he heard something later from the Prophet ﷺ which gave him a different opinion. Right? So there's different levels of hadith in terms of their strength. Right? And number three is, how did the Sahaba understand it? This is crucial. This is really where we can go, where we can stop people from falling into that literalism of the Ahl Hadith school of thought or the modernism of the rationalist school of thought. We simply say the Sahaba did not understand it in that way. Right? Which means when everyone's coming with different viewpoints, what we need to, number one, ask ourselves is, wait a minute, how did the Sahaba understand this? Did they understand it the way we are understanding it? Right? So, example today, we have some Muslims in our community who will say that, the way we are sitting here is haram. We need to put one curtain here and put the ladies behind the curtain. So they say, hold on, did the Sahaba do that? Did they do that? No, they never did that. Right? Only the Prophet ﷺ's wives did that, but all the Sahaba understood that was specific for his wives. That was specific for his wives. The other Sahaba did not do that. Right? There was a famous scholar amongst the Tabi'een, Aisha bint Talha. And one of the narrations I read, and I can dispute it authenticity, but nonetheless it was an authentic book. She was a very beautiful woman. And she was a scholar of hadith. And she was from the Tabi'een. She was the daughter of the Sahaba. And she never used to cover her face. And Abdullah ibn Umar used to try and convince her to cover her face. And she used to say, it's not compulsory, you can't make me do something that's not compulsory. And she continued to teach hadith to men without her face covered. Right? And she was from the Tabi'in, she was from the righteous Tabi'in. She was one of the most sought after women of her time for marriage. She's one of the greatest scholars of hadith from amongst the Tabi'in. So we go back to those first generations. How did they understand? The Sahaba, the Tabi'in, the Atba' Tabi'in. When we go back to their understanding, we can curb extremism. Right? So people come today, they say the Prophet ﷺ said we must fight the disbelievers until they believe in La ilaha illallah. Right? So hold on, did the Sahaba understand it that way? Because the Sahaba, when they conquered lands, they left the people to their religions. They didn't force Islam on the people of those lands. I mean, Spain and India were ruled by Muslims for hundreds of years, but the majority of the people in those lands remained non-Muslim because nobody forced Islam upon them. Right? So the Sahaba did not understand it the way you are understanding it. So this is a crucial point. Did the Sahaba understand it in that way? Number 4, is the hadith abrogated? Is the hadith abrogated? Right, let me give you an example of a hadith that I consider abrogated. The Prophet ﷺ said that, paraphrasing one of the hadiths, he basically said that women shouldn't visit graveyards. Right? There's another hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, I used to prevent you from visiting the graveyards. Now you may visit them to remember that. Furthermore, when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, did the female Sahaba visit his grave or not? They did. Even his daughter Fatima did. Right? Did they visit the Al-Baqi graveyard? They did. Right? So, based on the understanding of the Sahaba and this other hadith, we can see that first hadith is abrogated. It's something the Prophet ﷺ said early in his life. And the other hadith abrogates. Now again, there are other opinions as well, but just an example from my perspective of a hadith I consider abrogated. The Prophet ﷺ said something earlier, later in his life he said something different. Abrogation is a whole other topic to go into. Literally spend like 2-3 hours just teaching that subject alone. But just to give you an idea there. Okay, the next point is, were they modified by another hadith or by the Quran? So the Prophet ﷺ could have said something in a hadith, but there is another hadith where he explains it in more details. Right? So if you only know the first hadith and you don't know the second one, you're going to come to the wrong conclusion. Finally, and this is the point where a lot of people have a misunderstanding, is that hadith actually revelation? Right? We said the Sunnah is revelation. That doesn't mean every hadith is revelation. Right? And I'm going to give you a few examples of that. So, before we get into that, we have this issue nowadays in our community. When people find a hadith, they assume that everybody has to practice it, everybody has to follow it. But in reality, there are different types of hadiths, and scholars have broken them up into different categories. I've chosen what I consider the best categorization of hadith from this perspective, and that's the one done by the late Maliki scholar Ibn Ashur. Rahimahullah. So Ibn Ashur, 20th century scholar, also a reformist from the Maliki Madh'hab, he wrote this beautiful book on Maqasid al-Sharia. And Muhammad sells the book, but he told me it's too complicated for everyone to read, so I told him, don't worry, I'll make it easy with the slides. Right? Fascinating books. Literally the book that changed my entire perspective on fiqh. That's the book. If you want to know which book changed my whole world view on fiqh, it's Shaykh Ibn Ashur's book on Maqasid al-Sharia. So in that book, he divides hadith into 12 types. 12 types. We're going to go through all 12 types now. Meaning when the Prophet ﷺ said something, it can fall into one of these 12 categories. Number 1 being revelation. For example, when the Prophet ﷺ tells us about the Day of Judgment, he describes Jannah, he describes Jahannam, he talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he talks about the signs of the last day, he tells us Allah has commanded this. Right? All of this is revelation. Right? When the Prophet ﷺ says, don't eat with your left hand because shaitan eats with his left hand. How does the Prophet ﷺ know that shaitan eats with his left hand? Revelation. But here's the point. Not everything the Prophet ﷺ said and did is revelation. What is the proof for that? Right? I'll give you 3 hadiths as proof for that. Hadith number 1, the Battle of Badr. The Battle of Badr, the Prophet ﷺ, he sets his army up in a specific position. One of the Sahaba come to him and listen to the question of the Sahabi. The Sahabi asks him, this strategy, is it revelation or is it your opinion? And the Prophet ﷺ said, it's my opinion. Then the Sahabi said, I have a better idea, let's move our army that side. So the Prophet ﷺ listened to that Sahabi and he moved the army. Note, what did the Sahabi ask him? Is this revelation or is this your opinion? Meaning the Sahaba understood not everything he said is revelation. Number two, when the Prophet ﷺ moved to Medina, he saw that they were cross-pollinating their farms. And he told them, maybe it's better if you just leave it to nature or leave it to Allah. So they listened to him and they had a bad year of crop. So they went back to the Prophet ﷺ and they complained about it. And what did he say? He said, I'm here to teach you your religion. As for your worldly sciences, you all may know it better than me. So take your religion from me. Meaning what he said there about the crops was not revelation. He was just giving his opinion as a businessman from Makkah. He's not a farmer from Medina. The farmers from Medina understand farming better. Right? Hadith number 3. The Prophet ﷺ was once served a roasted lizard. Right? And he refused to eat it. Khalid bin Walid is there. He asked the Prophet ﷺ, are you not eating it because you don't like it or because Allah has prohibited it? He said, no, I just don't like it. I'm not used to eating this. So Khalid bin Walid ate the whole thing himself. Right? Did he go against the Sunnah? No. Why? Because again, he clarified first, this is not revelation. So from these 3 hadiths, we understand what? Not everything the Prophet ﷺ said or did is revelation. And so Ibn Ashur rahimahullah, he broke it up into 12 types. A second type, a fatwa. What's a fatwa? Hadith al-Qudsi will fall under revelation as well, right? Because he's telling us what Allah said, right? So that also falls under revelation. What's a fatwa? A lot of people don't understand what's a fatwa. We use this word a lot, but we don't understand it. A fatwa is a specific ruling for a specific person. Lots of people don't know that. So they read a fatwa on Islam Q&A in Saudi Arabia and they try to implement it in Durban, South Africa, and it doesn't work. Right? Because it was meant for a specific person in a specific place. It's not meant for us. Fatwas are specific. So the Prophet ﷺ may have made a specific ruling for a specific person in a specific case that's not meant to be applied by everybody in every case. Right? An example I will give in a later slide. I have an entire example on this one. Number 3, a judgment. 2 people are arguing. They both sit down before the Prophet ﷺ and he passes judgment in a certain person's favor. This is not revelation because in the hadith about this, the Prophet ﷺ himself said that. He said, I am judging between you and I might judge wrong. So on the day of judgment, you'll be held accountable for it. So that makes it clear that when he's judging between 2 people, it's not revelation. Right? The judgment he passes in these cases is not necessary for us to follow. Rather, we follow his sunnah of how to come to a judgment. How did he do it? He listened to both sides of the story. He looked at the evidence. He made a certain person take an oath. He brought in the witnesses. That's the sunnah. That's what we take from it. Not the specific conclusion he comes to. Right? Number 4 is political. So the Prophet ﷺ, he made political decision. The example I already gave, the Battle of Badr. Right? He made a political decision there, a strategy. That's not revelation. It was just his decision as in terms of politics. Right? Number 5 is just a recommendation. But again, we said sometimes the wording of the hadith is exaggerated and we end up thinking of it as a command. Very often, hadiths that we think are commands are just recommendations. Right? Case in point, the hadith about sitting and drinking. It's not compulsory to sit and drink. It's simply recommended. But because of the way the hadith is worded, a lot of people assume it's compulsory. Right? So sometimes the recommendation is given in the form of a command. Right? We do it all the time. Someone walks in and you say, why don't you have a seat? Or sit down. Now if you just say, 1,000 years in the future, Shaykh so-and-so said to so-and-so, sit down. Sounds like a command, taken out of context, right? But if you were there in the actual place seeing him talk to the person, it's okay, he's recommending that he sits down. Right? The next point is what we call reconciliation. So 2 people are arguing and the Prophet ﷺ tries to reconcile between them. And this is not a revelation. The best example of this, Zayd and Zainab. Right, Zayd, the Prophet's adopted son, was married to the Prophet's cousin Zainab, and the marriage was not working out. And the Prophet kept recommending that they reconcile. And eventually Zayd divorced her, and Allah revealed that he's marrying Zainab off to the Prophet ﷺ. Right? So here, the Quran is also saying that the Prophet's recommendation for these two to reconcile wasn't the best course of action. It's better for them to divorce because the marriage wasn't working out. Right? So the reconciliation here is not revelation, it's the Sunnah we take from that. The Sunnah we take from that is how you deal with people who are having marital problems. Sit them down, talk to them, try and reconcile, work things out. But you don't say that, because he said this is the case for every single marriage in the future. Number 7, advice. A man came to the Prophet ﷺ and said, give me advice. The Prophet ﷺ told him, don't get angry. My question to you, does that mean it's haram for any Muslim to get angry ever? There are plenty of good reasons to get angry. At least getting angry for the sake of Allah. Or when someone insults the Prophet ﷺ, it's good to get angry, right? And express it in a positive way. Please don't do something silly when you're angry, but the anger itself is a good thing in that case. So this is his advice to an individual. The scholars of Hadith say this individual had a problem with his temper. He often got into trouble and did wrong things when he was angry. So when he asked the Prophet for advice, the Prophet's advice to him was, don't get angry. Right? So we would say nowadays, if somebody else has a similar temperament, we will give them the same advice. But we won't take this as an absolute command. Because the wording of the Hadith, La taghdab, is in command form. We don't take it as an absolute command that it is haram to get angry in any circumstances. No. It's simply advice for the individual and anybody else in a similar situation. The next category, according to Ibn Ashur, is counseling. So the Prophet ﷺ offers somebody counseling, right, without them requesting it. So the difference he mentioned, again, this is very linguistic and technical. It really doesn't make a difference to us, but to the scholars of fiqh it makes a difference. Advice is when somebody asked for advice and the Prophet gave it. Counseling is when they did not ask for advice but the Prophet gave it. Right? So somebody may be doing business and the Prophet ﷺ walks up to them and tells them you should be doing this instead. That's his counseling for that individual. It doesn't mean that that type of business is not allowed for any of us. So that person's case, the other thing was better for him. Okay? Next two categories, again, very similar. Spiritual development or general advice. So, the Prophet ﷺ told one of the Sahaba, slipped my mind, I think it's Abdullah ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, that he must pray tahajjud. Does that make tahajjud compulsory on all of us? No. That's spiritual advice for this individual. Because he's on that level now, where the next level of advice that you're going to give him is what? Pray tahajjud. He's already doing everything else. Right? That command does not become a command for all of us. It's for him alone. General advice to the Ummah. So the Prophet ﷺ gives general advice to the Ummah, like in the command form, give gifts to each other. Is giving gifts to each other compulsory? No, it's general advice, even though the Arabic is in the command form. Admonition, a warning. A warning doesn't necessarily mean it's haram. It simply means it's bad character or it's bad manners or it's makruh. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ said, don't stand and drink. It doesn't necessarily mean it's haram. It could just mean it's not the best way to do it. Right? And finally, and this is the point many people don't understand, cultural or non-instructed, as Ibn Ashur called it. Simply hadiths describing how the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba lived their lives. These are not meant to be sources of our Sharia. So again, this is a major problem in our community, that we actually have people in our community who say, and this is in the books, I've read it in books and heard it in lectures locally. I've heard people say, it's haram to sit on a chair. We must sit on the floor. Because that's how the Prophet ﷺ sat. Right? Have you heard this before? Right? You must wear a thobe, because that's what the Prophet ﷺ wore. Right? You must dress like an Arab, because that's how the Prophet ﷺ dressed. This is a misunderstanding of which hadiths are instructive and which hadiths are non-instructive. These hadiths are simply descriptions of how the Prophet ﷺ lived. As long as he did not say, you must do it this way, it does not become a command. Right? But if it's simply describing how he was, because the Prophet ﷺ was an Arab, living in Arabia. He dressed just like how the non-Muslim Arabs dressed. Right? The people of his city, when people came to look for the Prophet ﷺ in Medina, they couldn't recognize him from anybody else. He didn't wear something special. He wasn't dressed like some, what we would see now, some buzuk. Right? But you can stand out from everybody else. He just looked like a normal guy. Just like these people. I mean, if he was living in South Africa today, he'd be just like a normal South African. He wouldn't stand out in his dressing. And this is why a lot of the scholars of the past said that the Sunnah is to dress according to the culture of your people, as long as it fits within the Sharia. We'll come to that in 2 weeks' time when we discuss culture as a source of Islamic law. So that was a lot. That was heavy. I'm going to give a few examples, but everybody clear up to this point. I tried to, as Muhammad was telling me that this book is too complicated, I said I'm going to make it as easy as possible, break it down into 12 points. Right? So you can understand now from these slides why you can't just take a hadith and make your own ruling. Right?
Where is Sirah? Sirah.
So Sirah is the same, because Sirah is a description of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Right? So Sirah is also a source of the Sunnah, just like hadith. It gets more complicated there because in the field of history, the scholars were more lax when it came to weak hadiths or weak narrations. So a lot of the narrations we will narrate in Sirah are weak. They are acceptable for Sirah, they're not acceptable for making laws. So we have to look at that as well, right? Because again, maybe we can discuss it in the Q&A. When it came to law and Aqidah, the scholars were very strict that the hadith is authentic. When it came to everything else, the majority of scholars didn't mind using weak hadiths. At least the majority of scholars throughout history. Okay, I'm going to give you 4 examples. Our time's almost up, so I'm not going to be able to go into all the examples in detail. But just what I want you to understand from these 4 examples is that a lot of people have this wrong idea that when they see someone with a different understanding, they immediately jump to the idea that, oh, this person is rejecting the hadith. No, people just have different understandings of hadith. Case in point, the hadith of child custody, right? There are 3 hadiths here. One shows the Prophet ﷺ giving the child to the father. Another shows the Prophet ﷺ giving the child to the mother. Another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ tells the child to choose for himself. Now, traditionally, the majority of madh'habs each chose one hadith. So one madh'hab says, father's right. Another madh'hab says, mother's right. Another madh'hab says, his choice when he reaches a certain age. Ibn Ashur's approach here is brilliant. I've actually followed his opinion on this. He says, hold on. The Prophet ﷺ was working here, as you mentioned earlier, judging between people. He's taking it on a case-by-case basis. He's not laying down the Sharia. In certain cases, the father is the better parent. In certain cases, the mother is the better parent. In some cases, both of them are great parents. You know what I'm saying? So you can't just say that this is what the Sharia says. He says, just like the Prophet ﷺ gave different rulings for different children, our position should be that this is left up to case by case. As each family comes to you fighting over who gets child custody, you deal with each case differently and your ruling can be different in each case. If you come across a family, they're getting a divorce, the father is abusive, give the child to the mother. You come across a family, the mother is abusive, the father is a good guy, give the child to the father. You come across a family, they're both great people, they just don't get along, equal custody. Or let the child choose for himself, right? Or both of them are abusive, give it to the grandparents. There's no set ruling here. This is the beauty of this approach. There's no set ruling here. You now take it case by case, right? So this is how you can reconcile between all the hadiths and come up with one very dynamic position, which is by far to me the most just and the most fair of all these positions. And again, none of these scholars reject the hadith, they just have different approaches. Number 2, Isbaal, or wearing your pants below the ankles. And I purposely wore mine below the ankles today for this hadith. Right? So again, context. A lot of people don't understand the context. In the olden days, how would the Arabs dress? The kings. Kings would have those long flowing robes with someone carrying it in the back to show off that they're wealthier than everybody else. So the Prophet ﷺ, commenting on this, said, whoever drags their garments below their ankles out of arrogance will be in the hellfire. Right? This hadith, my position, is prohibiting arrogance. It's not prohibiting a specific style of dressing. And again, different positions. Right? So Hanafi position, by the way, there's actually difference of opinion in the Hanafi madhab on this. But in our community, the classical Hanafi position and the Salafi position is haram. The Prophet said haram, pants must be above the ankles. Right? But like I said, in the Hanafi madhab, there's difference of opinion. Imam Ash-Shafi said, no, only if you're doing it out of arrogance, then it's haram. Right? So, why is there a difference of opinion? Well, there's different versions of the hadith. One hadith says whoever drags their pants below their ankles will be in the hellfire. The other one says whoever drags their pants below their ankles out of arrogance will be in the hellfire. But it doesn't mention pants, it mentions garments. Right? I'm just paraphrasing. because there's another opinion there as well. So one hadith mentions arrogance, one doesn't. Some ulama go with the one that doesn't. They say that's the hadith, the other one's just giving an explanation. The other one say no, that's not the full hadith, the other one's the full hadith. Right? Furthermore, Abu Bakr's clothes used to be below his ankles. And the Prophet ﷺ told him, don't worry about it, you're not doing it out of arrogance. Again, different interpretations come about. Right? How do you reconcile between these hadiths? Different positions. My point being, number one, this issue, you won't even find it in the classical books of fiqh because they didn't consider it important. It literally, I tried to do the research and I actually asked some of my teachers about this. I asked them, when did this become an issue? And one of them told me, maybe about 60 years ago. Right? And I asked him, who made it the issue? To be frank, he said two groups made it the issue. Salafis and Tabligis. Right? He said nobody else before that, no Hanafis, no Shafis, no Malikis before that, made this an issue. They may say it's haram, but they'll say it's haram as a minor sin. Not even a minor sin, like a minor sin. Like so minor they forgot to mention it in the book. They didn't bring it up at all. It's like an issue where even the ulama who believe it to be haram, they never really mention it. Right? Now again, we live in a time where some people take the hadith literally. They take their understanding of hadith as the absolute understanding and they try to enforce it upon the entire community. Right? And then this now leads to fights. And every day when I go online, I see fights about this. Literally, the ummah spends the whole day on Twitter fighting over whether pants should be below the ankles or not, when there are so many more important issues affecting the ummah. Right? I know someone's going to watch this video online and fight about it in the comment section as well. Next one is one of my more controversial opinions. Last time I mentioned this in South Africa, I got into a lot of trouble. Never mind. So, traveling without a guardian. The Prophet ﷺ said, whoever travels without a mahram, right, this is not acceptable, whichever woman. What's the context? Makkah and Medina were at war. What would have happened if one of the women of Medina left Medina on her own during that time? She would have been kidnapped by the people of Makkah and the other tribes. So understand the context, right? So majority position, woman cannot travel without a mahram. But in the Shafi Madh'hab and amongst contemporary scholars, there is another opinion. So about 12 years ago, I attended a class with Shaykh Ismail Kamdar, may Allah free him from the tyrants, where he was asked about this. And he said, what I'm going to tell you now is what he said. I've been following this position ever since I heard it from him. He said that in that time, there was a war. Because there was a war, the Prophet ﷺ said this. After that, he said, if you study the history, if you look at the time of Umar, the time of Usman onwards, you will find many, many stories of women traveling from city to city all alone. It was a norm in the time of Umar. Right? It was the norm in the times after, throughout our history. And they even said that you won't find the ulama or the Khalifa saying you can't do it. Nobody was saying that. So the position that he took, and even Dr. Yusuf Qaradawi takes the same position, is that when there is a genuine danger of a woman traveling alone, then this law comes into place. When there isn't that genuine danger, then you don't worry about it, it's fine to travel without a mahram. Right? And again, this controversy pops up again now. The only country in the world that was actually enforcing that law, they changed it now as well. Right? If you look at Muslim countries, 99% of Muslim countries don't enforce this law. Right? There was only one country that was enforcing it, but even they now have changed it and everyone's angry about it. But technically, they're right to change it. Because even Imam Ash-Shafi said if a group of women are traveling for Umrah together, they don't need a mahram. So why should a government stop them from doing that? Right? So again, this is the issue where I believe it's perfectly fine if it's not dangerous, and I know a lot of people will be angry about that. Okay, you can see I'm getting very controversial in my examples. I just love the controversial examples. The hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, where the Prophet ﷺ said that towards the end of time, there will be a group of people that will make halal alcohol and fornication the usage of stringed musical instruments. Ibn Hazm was of the position this hadith is weak. And so his position was the default position, which in Islam, what did I say is the default position? Things are halal until proven to be haram. Right? So he says halal. Nowadays, Dr. Yusuf Qaradawi takes the same position. Majority position, the hadith is in Sahih Bukhari, it's authentic. So there are differences of opinion on what exactly it prohibits. So some madhhabs will say all instruments are prohibited. Some say no, the daf is allowed. Some will say no, all percussion instruments are allowed. Some say the daf is allowed but only on Eid and only on weddings. Right? So there are all these different positions. So you can see there's no one position here. There's literally 10 different opinions or more on this topic. Right? My favorite opinion, the opinion I follow, Imam Al-Ghazali. Right? And later on, Al-Andalusi from the Ottoman Empire came to the same opinion. So Imam Al-Ghazali in his Ihya Ulumuddin, he says this hadith is contextual. The Prophet ﷺ only ever mentioned music in negative terms when talking about fornication and alcohol. So he said that's the context. So when music leads to these things or is accompanied by these things, then it's a problem. Right? And so in his other book, which I read, was it The Alchemy of Happiness? Right? He says there, this is his quotation from Imam Al-Ghazali, he said music that brings a person closer to Allah is good. Music that takes a person away from Allah is haram. And music that does neither is just harmless entertainment. Right? You can open The Alchemy of Happiness, you'll find the statement there from Imam Al-Ghazali. Right? So notice again the difference of opinion. Firstly, is the hadith authentic or not? Now you may be asking, but it's in Sahih Bukhari. Is every hadith in Sahih Bukhari authentic? 99.9%. 99.9%. At the end of the day, one of the reasons we believe the Quran is a miracle is why? There's no mistakes. Why do we consider that a miracle? Because it's humanly impossible. Question, Sahih Bukhari compiled by a human being or by Allah? By a human being. So out of the 9,000 or 7,000 hadiths in Sahih Bukhari, there are about 10 or 20 that the ulama have difference of opinion on whether they are authentic or not. Right? About 10 or 20. This is one of them. What's interesting about this hadith in Sahih Bukhari, there's no chapter in Sahih Bukhari about music. Now his chapter headings are according to fiqh. He has fiqh chapter. There's no chapter on music. Where do you find this hadith? In the chapter prohibiting alcohol. Without any chain of narrators. This is the thing. He doesn't mention the chain of narrators. Which is rare for Sahih Bukhari. So what some of the scholars say is that when Imam Bukhari does not mention the chain of narrators, it's because he's mentioning it by the way and it doesn't reach his level of authenticity. It's not authentic according to him. Otherwise he would have mentioned the full chain of narrators. Right? So now this hadith becomes disputed. Some ulama say it's weak, some say it's hasan, some say it's sahih. Even though it's in Sahih Bukhari, there are differences of opinion on its authenticity. Right, now next week when we discuss ijma, I'm going to go deeper into this topic because there is a wrong claim of ijma on this issue, and I'll discuss what Imam Ashur has to say about that next week. With that we come to our conclusion. We went a bit longer than expected this week, but we'll open the floor to Q&A this now. Just very briefly, to conclude, the Quran and Sunnah are the basis of fiqh, although the majority of fiqh comes from the Sunnah. Right? The Sunnah is necessary. You cannot have fiqh without the Sunnah. It's just not possible. Right? We have to have the Sunnah. However, people have different approaches towards the Sunnah. Some take it literally, some don't. Some regard certain hadiths as authentic, other people regard it as weak. Some look at the context, some take it on the wording. Some consider certain hadiths abrogated, others don't. They have all these different opinions. Is it authentic? Is it legislative? Is it authoritative? Is it abrogated? Is it modified by another hadith? There's so many things to keep in mind. At the end of the day, my message, the main conclusion I want you to take from this is, don't just grab a hadith and pass it away. Right? When people trained in Usul al-Fiqh do this, what do? They look at all the Quranic verses on the topic, all the hadiths on the topic, the opinions of the Sahaba, the opinions of the previous scholars. They cross-analyze all of this, they discuss it, and if they are good scholars, they will make salah, then they ask Allah to guide them to the correct position before they say anything. Right? It's not just a matter of looking at the hadith and say, oh, this hadith is in Bukhari, I'm going to hold it. Right? You have to understand it from all of these different perspectives. With that, we come to our conclusion. I know we covered a lot in 1 hour today. I know quite a bit of it is on controversial topics. I believe we have to discuss these topics openly. I want you to discuss these topics openly 10 years ago. But people keep saying it's not time, it's not time. It's never going to be time. It's never going to be time to discuss anything. Right? So, discuss it. Whatever happens, happens. At the end of the day, we need to have discussions. People need to know other opinions exist. And whoever takes it, whoever wants to make refutation videos of it can do so as well. Refutation videos also haram because they're videos. I don't know. So with that we come to our conclusion. Jazakallah khair. Any questions? We've got 20 minutes for questions.
Yes, from a layman's point of view, it's very difficult to get through hadith. If, like for instance, Maulana, and I ask you about hadith, and I've got a firm belief about hadith. But I won't be able to justify it because I don't have the extent of knowledge.
Yeah.
So it's been difficult for me to question it. This is an example.
Sure.
I know that there is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said that all women go to the Eidgah, whether you implement this or not, because they want to show the strength of Islam. But then nowadays you get the position of some people. They say you cannot go to the Eidgah, you can't even go to the women can't go to the mosque either.
Yeah.
So now for me to question that from a language point of view.
So how do you do that?
How do I do
How you do that is that you latch on to other ulama from the other point of view. That you say, you saying this, but these ulama say the opposite, and this is their evidence. Right? So you can tell them, listen, I respect you, but I'm following this alim's fatwa. Yeah? They can't really say anything you're following an alim's fatwa. They can't tell you you make your own opinions. You're following an alim. Right? So he's talking about the issue of a woman not being allowed in the masjid, which is, honestly, I think in this day and age, it's only our communities that's left on this issue. Most of the world has moved on from that. Right? In fact, people watching this overseas will be shocked to learn that in South Africa, well, masjids don't allow women.
Cape Town is quite prevalent.
Yeah, in Cape Town, alhamdulillah, that's like a different country, really, when it comes to fiqh. It's like a different country when it comes to fiqh. It's a completely different culture when it comes to fiqh. But in Durban, we have this problem. The Prophet ﷺ said, do not prevent women from going to the masjid. And our people say, we will prevent women from going to the masjid. Right? How do we deal with this? From a layman's point of view, you can't just walk up to your alim and say, but the hadith says this. He's not going to take you seriously. Right? Or in the other point he mentioned, Eid, where the Prophet ﷺ said on Eid day, everybody must go for salah, even the woman who is menstruating must go and sit there. Look at how he said, everybody must go. Even if you don't have salah, you must still go. Right? And so, how do you reconcile that with our ulama in this country saying it's haram for women to go for Eid salah? You can't reconcile. You can simply say, I respect your opinion, but there are thousands of ulama across the world who hold a different opinion based on this hadith. I'm following those ulama. Right? And if you don't like what they say, please have a discussion with them and let us listen to the discussion. Right? That's it. Respect their opinion without getting into a fight, because as you said, they're not going to take you seriously. Let's put it this way, even if you are an alim, they're not going to take you seriously. Because some people are very set that their understanding of hadith is the only understanding of hadith. And it's very hard to have discussions with those kind of people. Any other questions?
Two of them. The simple one.
Sure.
When you're hearing the literally, not that of your phone or whatever, but from the masajid, again you see different people doing different things. We've had scholars where when the adhan is on, skip quiet completely.
Yeah.
Right? And others carry on as you would. And then others, I've seen it in the Haram. If someone once stopped me from even reading Quran when the adhan started, let's go to the Quran and listen. So that's a simple one. What is the...
Again, it comes down to how do you understand the hadith. Is the hadith telling you to not talk during the azan? Is it a recommendation or is it an obligation? So you're going to have two different opinions. And even from those who take it as a recommendation, you're going to have those who are going to follow the recommendation in every situation. And those who are going to say, well, I'm talking about Allah's deen, so it may not apply to this situation. So it simply boils down to different people are going to take the hadith on that topic, from different perspectives. So some people will say it's compulsory, you're not allowed to talk or say anything when the adhan is on. Right? You have to just simply respond to the adhan. Others say no, that's mustahab. So if someone is doing something else, there's no harm to it. Right? So that really comes down to how they understand the hadith on that issue.
More complicated one. When you explain the processes and what is involved in coming to an opinion, I'm going to give you an example.
Sure.
Someone I know, having marital problems, consultants he shared. And they share on the basis of a dream or having made whatever, and having never spoken to the wife, recommended divorce.
Okay.
Right? And which he did. Now, that one part of my question is, without knowing there's two sides to every story, you literally went on what my friend said and not heard the side from the wife. So that, and then the nice one in South Africa, the easy one was which people are called kafir. And the process is, if it's so complicated over simple things, I imagine before you call some people kafir, many of us in the room, there will be, what sort of involvement does that take?
Okay. So the two separate questions, right? The first one is about someone passing a ruling based on. Honestly, there's no basis for that in any fiqh, any madh'hab. You see, the problem we have nowadays is throughout the Muslim world, to the bulk of history and right today in the Muslim countries, when a husband and wife have problems, they don't go to their shaykh. Who do they go to? The qadi. They go to the judge of the community. He will listen. He has a process that he has to follow. And the process he has to follow is he has to listen to both sides of the story. And then he has to make a decision. Now here in South Africa, we don't have that system. We should have that system. We should have our own qadis who people can go to and who have this system that they are forced to follow. One of the conditions being is they have to hear both sides of the story before they say anything. And they have to follow a certain process in their arriving. They can't just base their ruling on a dream. Right? It has to follow a certain process. So maybe that can solve it if we can set up a system like that. Again, all the Muslim countries have this. Right? They do have people you go to sort out these issues, who are trained, who have a certain process, and they have certain things they have to do. Our community, it's more like a free-for-all. People go to whoever's going to say what they want to hear. That's what it comes down to. So if somebody knows about 5 different ulama personally, he knows only one of them is going to tell him yes, divorce her, he'll go and ask that alim only. Right? So now if we set up a process, we set up a system that this is the way to do it, that's probably the only way we can actually solve this. Otherwise people are just going to, if we are a non-Muslim country, people are going to have a free-for-all and do what they want. The other question that you asked was, the kafir issue, right? Calling someone a kafir. Very complicated process. The standard position of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah throughout history is, we do not make takfir of someone except for very, very few conditions. Right? One of them being if they believe in another prophet. That's like one where there's like consensus. If they're following another prophet. So like how the Christians wouldn't consider us Christians because we follow Prophet Muhammad and they consider him a false prophet. Like that we wouldn't consider someone following Rashad Khalifa or Elijah Muhammad or Ghulam Ahmad Qadiani a Muslim because they're following another prophet. Right? That's one issue. Beyond that, there are very few issues you can honestly, there are a lot of issues you can say this issue is kufr or this is an act of kufr, but you will not make judgment on the individual. This is very important. For most issues you will not make judgment on the individual, because as long as you believe in the 5 pillars of Islam and the 6 pillars of Iman, you're not going to make takfir of them. The issue I had with a couple years ago, and one of our local Maulana sent out the email saying that all of the Shia are kafir. So I sent him a reply saying you cannot say that. You cannot say that. You can say they are wrong. You can say they are deviant sect. You can say some of them are kafir. You cannot say all of them. Because if you were raised in Iran, in an Iranian family, in that environment, you'd be Shia. Right? You would be, because that's all you know. So my approach is, I'm against the belief, but as far as the individual is concerned, I don't pronounce any judgment on the individual. Right? Rather, I believe most people have in Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah Aqidah, we call this uzr bil jahal, the excuse due to ignorance. That's a principle of our Aqidah, that people are excused because of their ignorance. Right? This was a big issue in Arabia about 300 years ago, where there was a certain scholar whose name I'm not going to mention because I'll get in trouble with another group for this, who was basically making takfir of people and killing them for going to the graves, going to the mazars. So basically he waged jihad against them for this, saying that they are kafir. And all the other ulama wrote to him saying that you need to make uzr bil jahal. These are ignorant people, they don't know what they're doing, you can't call them kafir. Right? So that became the big issue of that time. So that's really what it is today, that as a Muslim, when you see somebody else doing something wrong, number one thing is make excuse for them. They don't know what they're doing. Right? It's only when certain evidences are put against the person, that, okay, this person, we've taught him the correct understanding of Islam. We presented to him all the evidences. He understands all the evidences. But now out of stubbornness, he's doing something that is clear kufr. Then only we can pronounce kufr on the individual. The Muslims of the past were so lax on this issue of takfir that even the Khawarij and the Mu'tazilites never made takfir of them. Khawarij and Mu'tazilites are considered Muslim, they're not considered non-Muslim. Right? Even ISIS. Right? I think Shaykh Yaqubi posted this in his book, refuting ISIS. He said, they call us kafir, we won't call them kafir. I mean, that makes us just like them. They're Muslim, they're wrong, 100% wrong in what they're doing, but they're Muslim. A lot of laymen, they say, they can't be Muslim, they're doing this. That's not how it works. You can't say someone can't be Muslim because they're doing something that's wrong. Right? So we don't make takfir of the Khawarij, we don't make takfir of the Mu'tazilites, even with the Shia. For the bulk of our history, Shia lived in Muslim countries as Muslim. They didn't pay jizya, they weren't kicked out of the country, they were treated as Muslim citizens, right? By the Ottomans, by the Abbasids, by the Umayyads. Yes, few here and there, Salim the Grim went and fought them, but that's like an exception, that's not the norm. The norm was that they were treated as Muslim citizens of their country, right? The exception was that once in a while someone came along and did the opposite, right? So that's the point on takfir. The main point there being is we need to revive this practice of uzr bil jahl, excuse someone because of their ignorance. That's something we need to revive. Yes?
Shaykh Kamdar was once asked whether music is haram or halal.
Sure.
And he gave the best answer. He said halal music is halal and haram music is haram.
Yeah.
The second point is that in those days they used to wear the garments below the ankles, dragging as a form of
Showing off.
arrogance.
Yeah.
These days you find people with their pants above the ankles, using it as a form of spiritual pride.
One of the early Muslims said that.
Yeah.
So this is probably happened in the 3rd century, I think, or 2nd century. There was one sheikh whose pants was below, his garments were below his ankles, and one of his students asked him about him. He said, nowadays people are wearing it above their ankles out of arrogance to show they're more pious than everybody else, so on purpose they has mine below. And this was like in the 2nd century that was already starting.
Anyway, a serious question. Are there any hadith which are in contradiction to the spirit of the Quran?
The spirit of the Quran.
The spirit of the Quran. Or maybe even the letter of the Quran, but we have a sound chain. That means the isnad and the chain of narrators is solid, but comes into contradiction with some of the...
It's a deep question, and one that requires a whole lecture on its own. So basically, this is something in hadith science, they call it, judging the authenticity of a hadith based on its content, not on its narration, on chain of narrators. And the scholars of the past did do this, but with very, very strict conditions. There are a few hadiths which have authentic chain of narrators, but some scholars did reject it because it contradicted either more stronger hadiths or it contradicted the Quran in certain ways. So they said there must be a mistake somewhere in the chain, we just can't figure out what the mistake is. That's the way they looked at it. Maybe there's a mistake in this chain we just didn't realize, because there's no way the Prophet ﷺ could have said this. Very few. The problem nowadays is when you open this door is that a lot of the modernists will jump on this and they'll just, any hadith that contradicts their understanding of the Quran, oh, this hadith can't be authentic, the hadith can't be authentic. You can't take it to that level. It has to be done through the ulama, through this process. I'll give you one hadith example of that. That some of the scholars said was not authentic, even though its content is, even though it's called an authentic chain of narrators. The hadith about, I don't know, this long hadith about the Dajjal being on an island, and the Sahaba found the island and they met the Jassasa. The hadith is in Sahih Bukhari, but there are ulama who consider it not authentic. Why? Because there are so many hadiths that say towards the end of time Dajjal will be born and he will grow up and then he will become Dajjal. So here you have many hadiths saying he's going to be born and he's going to grow up. And you have one hadith from one chain of narration saying that he's chained up on an island somewhere in the ocean. Furthermore, we have Google Earth now, which island? It becomes even more contradictory there. So that makes it even more complex in our times. And there's even other issues there. The hadith says that this story was said in the masjid in front of all of the Sahaba. But we have only one Sahabi narrating the entire story. Nobody else mentions it ever. Not a single Sahabi mentioned besides one. So even though it's in Sahih Bukhari, there are ulama who have said this hadith is not authentic because it contradicts stronger hadiths and it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense from their perspective. Now there are other scholars who reconcile. In fact, some of the classical scholars consider it time travel. That literally the Sahabi got lost in the ocean and end up in the future. That's their way of reconciling. But the fact is, this is something they did. They did find hadiths, and if they found that there is no way to reconcile this hadith with the Quran or with a stronger hadith, then they would say that this hadith is weak. We just don't know where in the chain of narrators it's weak, but it has to be a weakness somewhere, right? And again, it's a very complex field to get into. It's very dangerous to get into without the proper training, because that's where modernism comes from. It really comes from going into that without the proper training. But ulama need to do that. They have to look at hadith from that perspective as well. Any other questions?
Last Friday for Jummah, there was the local mufti who was speaking about the Sunnah. And he gave a definition which I haven't done before. He said the Sunnah is not just what the Prophet ﷺ said, but it's also what the generations that came after him, up to the Imams. it's all part of the Sunnah. I mean, that's going against the definition we did.
Yeah, that definition doesn't come in any of the books of fiqh. I know whether he made it up or he heard it from his teacher, but no classical scholar understands the Sunnah like that. Classically, Sunnah, in different meanings, in different contexts, Sunnah means something that's recommended in terms of fiqh. In terms of Usul fiqh, it's what the Prophet ﷺ said and did and taught. Right? That's the Sunnah. This idea that everything that came after that is Sunnah, so where do you stop? Where do you stop? Because like I asked someone, the topi, the Prophet ﷺ never wore the topi. Why do you say the topi is Sunnah? And he said, no, Sunnah includes what our elders do. That's what he told me. Sunnah includes what our elders do. Whose elders? Because elders of which country? Elders of which society? I mean, how many generations of elders are you going to look at? Yeah, only they will say that, right? But the fact is that there's no usul fiqh basis for what they are saying. And there's no way to qualify what they are saying. And firstly, where do you get the idea that that's Sunnah? Allah never said that you should do that. The Prophet ﷺ never said you should do that. The Sahaba never said you should do that. In fact, the Sahaba themselves were so dynamic on this issue that when they moved from Medina to Syria, their way of dressing changed completely. Why? Because they moved from one culture to another. They stopped dressing like the Arabs of Makkah and Medina. They started dressing like the Romans of Syria. Right? They immediately adapted to the dress of the area they moved to. And that's why when Umar went to Syria, he couldn't recognize the other Sahaba because they were dressed completely different from how he was accustomed to seeing them. Right? So clearly they didn't understand that to be Sunnah. So where do we get that from?
By the way, he was a pure literalist. I mean, the topic for Jummah was about changing the design of your bathroom, not to take a shower, but to sit in the bathroom. That was the level of the new man.
On that note, I've heard some senior people of the Jamaat, senior, I really mean senior, they'll tell you it's not Sunnah.
Mm-hmm.
The dress code that the Jamaat has is not Sunnah. They tell you it is the dress code of our elders.
And that's more honest. That's more honest.
This is now I'm talking about seriously senior Jamaat people who told me this. Not now, some 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's a more honest
Today it
position.
says, no, this is not Sunnah, this is dress code of our pious elders.
Now, I went to a masjid, they said it's wajib. They had a big poster on the wall saying it's wajib to wear the soap and the topi. I mean, where they get that from? Yeah, I think we can conclude. We didn't take any question on the ladies' side, so okay.
Do you ever make tafweed of hadith the way you make tafweed of Quran? As in you just submit the meaning to Allah because you can't rationally understand it or it goes or you accept your
Many hadiths like that.
understanding.
Yeah, there's many hadiths like that, particularly in the realm of Aqidah. For example, the hadith where the Prophet said that Allah descends in the last third of the night to answer our du'as. Technically, it's always the last third of the night somewhere in the world. So how do you understand the hadith? You just leave the meaning to Allah. Right? There is no way to rationalize the hadith because technically every hour of the day is the last third of the night somewhere in the world. So is Allah continuously descending? What does it mean? Right? The classical position is you leave the meaning of the hadith to Allah because the purpose of the hadith is to make us wake up for tahajjud. It's not for us to think about how does Allah descend or anything like that. It's a hadith of encouraging people to pray tahajjud, not a hadith of trying to understand how Allah is. We can't. Allah is beyond our understanding.
I understand that at the Aqidah level, but what about
Fiqh.
hadiths that have like social implications?
Okay,
like,
so
like women are deficient in intellect.
yeah, okay, now that hadith as well.
Do you make the feel or something like that?
Well, the hadith had different interpretations throughout history. There's no agreed upon understanding of what the hadith means. So yeah, there are ulama who have done that. There are many ulama who have done that. They said that hadith shouldn't be taken literally. Some even said it was referring to a woman of a specific community.
So
Right?
if you say, I'll stop and I'm not interpreting.
Yeah, you can even say that. You can say, you know what, the Prophet said this, I don't know what he means by this. I'm not going to take it personally.
So we just leave it.
Yeah, we just leave it as something he said because literally there's no fiqh ruling to take from that hadith. There's no belief to take from that hadith. So there's no reason that we have to take the hadith and find a way to put it into our lives. We simply say the Prophet said it, we acknowledge he said it, I don't know what he means by it. You can't say that because if it was a hadith about fiqh, then yes, we need to take some ruling from it. But here there is no, what ruling are you going to take from the hadith, whichever way you go? There is no ruling. Right? It's only some people use it to bash the opposite gender over their head, but there's no ruling you take from it.
They can't lead.
or they can't lead. There's other...
The view that is to say that the woman cannot be leaders.
Yeah, then again, that's a whole other issue to go into. If you want to spend another 1 hour on that topic.
Yes, last one.
When you study the Quran, a lot of the commentaries or the tafsir bring into the context so you're able to understand how the verse. Is any work related to the hadith? For example, the very one that you mentioned, pulling up your clothes above your ankle.
The context.
But
the books of commentary of hadith do this. So the commentary, they call the sharh, they are commentaries of hadith. So for example, if Sahih Muslim, Imam An-Nawawi has a commentary on it. So when you get the Arabic edition of Sahih Muslim,
We got the English.
you got the English of it as well. Okay, mashallah, that's great. So what this book will have, it'll have the hadith, narrated by Imam Muslim, and then you'll have Imam Nawawi's comments on it. So Imam Nawawi will mention the context, he'll mention the story behind it, he'll mention what led up to it, the other hadiths related to it. He mentions all of that, right? So these type of books, they call commentaries on hadith. They do this job, that they will mention the context and how, and that's how we get like most of the hadiths I mentioned, they mention the context. This is where they come from. They come from those type of books. And they, again, just like with the Quran, the context comes primarily from the Sahaba. The Sahaba will say this happened, and then the Prophet said this. The other hadith just says what he says without mentioning what happened before it. So the Sahaba give us the context, right? So Asbabul Nuzul, that's what it's called for the Quran, reasons for revelation. I think for hadith it's called, I can't remember the exact thing, it was Asbabul Wurud, was the reason for occurrence, or the reason of statement. I can't remember the exact Arabic for it. But there is a similar field for hadith as there is for Quran when it comes to that. Okay, anything else? Okay, done.
Jazakallah khair. I think we're done. Again,